Alexandra Morton grew up in Connecticut in the USA. From a young age, she was interested in the methods of communication used by animals. The more she's learned about marine mammals, the more her thirst for knowledge has grown. Her scientific adventure started in California.
I started working in a tank in Los Angeles, and I was studying dolphins, and the killer whales gave birth. The people who ran the oceanarium asked me to go and record the sounds of the baby and the parents. And as soon as I heard the voices of the killer whales, I was like, oh, this is the animal I meant to study.
After a few years studying the behaviour of killer whales in captivity, Alexandra wondered if the fact of being confined might not influence their ability to communicate. She decided to go to look for the family of these killer whales, which were captured when they were very young.
Killer whales are distributed all over the world. They're quite common. We know 4 populations here in the province. There are the southern residents, which eat salmon and are seen between Victoria, Vancouver and Seattle in the south. We have the northern residents, which also eat salmon. We have the migrants, which only eat sea mammals. And we have the ones from the high seas. This 4th population is the most mysterious. We rarely see them in the waters close to the coast.
Hi, Courtney.
Peter Ross is a researcher at the Institute of Ocean Sciences in Vancouver. He knows killer whales well because he's been studying the health of the populations that visit the coastal waters of British Columbia for several years.
The 4 populations of killer whales in the province of British Columbia are very distinct. They don't communicate together or reproduce between the populations. They don't mix, so each population is very specific.
Alors, chaque population est très spéciale.
During her research, Alexandra discovered that the killer whales in the Los Angeles aquarium came from a population living north of Vancouver Island. So she went to Broughton Strait, where her investigation started.
I bought a little inflatable boat, and I talked 2 friends into going with me, and we piled everything into a pickup truck and drove to Canada, got to Alert Bay, pumped up the boat, put all our stuff in it, and there were killer whales suddenly. It was scary because killer whales are big, and all the whales I had seen were in tanks, and now suddenly I was in the little boat and they were in the wild.
Each family of killer whales has a specific language which differentiates them from the others. Alexandra was certain she could find the clan she was looking for.
We pushed off and motored out to them really slowly and stopped and put the underwater microphones in. And it was exactly the family I was looking for. The sounds were so beautiful. I'd always heard them in a tank, and you could hear the pumps and the drains, and now the sounds were just rolling on, echoing through many kilometers of ocean. I basically took one sniff of this place and went, this is my habitat.
After a few years, Alexandra Morton moved with her family to a small remote community, Echo Bay, located on Guilford Island in the Broughton archipelago. Alexandra continued her research on the communication between killer whales. In both summer and winter, she recorded the sounds, fascinated by the extent of the vocal patterns which she endeavoured to decode.
They have a wonderful pattern. So when they start a conversation, they go, "Pakaw, pakaw, pakaw," and then they might go, "Meow." And then if they're foraging and everything's good, they go, "Meow." And if they're very excited, they'll go, "Meow." And then when they're ending the conversation, it's "Pakaw, pakaw, pakaw," back and forth like that. So it was very easy to recognize them.
For years, Alexandra lived close to her killer whales. She observed them and photographed them in order to distinguish them more easily. Then one day, she had a nasty surprise. The killer whales were nowhere to be found. In the following weeks, she crisscrossed the area around the archipelago without seeing her protégés. For Alexandra, this disappearance was a disaster. What had happened? Where had the killer whales gone? Alexandra Morton tried to find out the reasons for the departure of her family of killer whales. From one day to the next, the clan left the places they had frequented for several years. This unexplained phenomenon left her mystified.
At first, of course, I didn't know they weren't going to come back, so I kept looking for them. And as the years went by, I began thinking, I can't be a whale researcher and stay here. I should really go somewhere else. But now my son was in school, and I had a beautiful little home, and I didn't want to move. And then I began to think, well, as the biologist here, really, maybe it's my responsibility to do something about this. I shouldn't just up and leave.
In order to find her protégés, she went to see her friend Paul Spong, a researcher who studies interactions between families of killer whales. Located on Hansen Island, Orca Lab is a listening and recording lab right in the middle of a crossroads where different families of killer whales residing in the north congregate. Alexandra hoped to find an explanation there.
But yeah, no, years.
We are here, and in each of these different places, we have a hydrophone, like an ear under the ocean, and it's connected to a radio transmitter, and the radio transmitter has an antenna, and we're listening to these radios on these receivers here. And there's 6 of them, and when we hear orcas, we start a recording. And then we can track them around, and we can hear them moving from one space to another. And then from the sounds that they make, we can tell in many cases which family group we're listening to. The orca families are divided into acoustic clans. And clans are families that share elements of the dialects that they use.
The Orca Lab technology finally located Alexandra's family of killer whales 60 kilometers further to the north. For Alexandra, it was a dilemma. If she wanted to pursue her research on the killer whales, she would have to leave Echo Bay, where she had lived since the early 1980s. Alexandra and her husband Robin Morton, a wildlife filmmaker, spent their days on the water following the movements of the killer whales. The Morton family experienced happy times. Robin filmed the whales while Alexandra listened to and recorded their melodies. Suddenly, tragedy struck without warning. As Robin was filming a killer whale underwater, his diving equipment failed. Alexandra was faced with a difficult choice. To save her husband, she would have to leave her 3-year-old son in the boat. After making the boat secure, she dived in. But it was too late.
Ooh, I was mad at that killer whale for a long time. Because you hear about stories about dolphins pushing people to shore, and it was an irrational thought, but I suspect she saw something was wrong and didn't like it. And yeah, I really miss them to this day, because never found anybody quite like that.
In spite of the huge void left by Robin's death, Alexandra decided to stay in Echo Bay with her son Jarrett. She was more determined than ever to find the reasons that drove the killer whales away from around the archipelago. For her, this displacement was an alarm bell. Something must have been going on in the waters of the strait that was affecting the marine ecology and the environment of the killer whales.
The thing that attracts killer whales is food. They're looking for food to eat, and the behavior, the movements of all individuals, of populations, of clans, reflect the presence of food, quite simply. We have 2 populations that eat salmon almost exclusively. It's estimated at 90% of their annual diet. In recent decades in British Columbia, we've seen that several stocks of salmon are reducing.
Durant les dernières décennies en Colombie-Britannique, on a vu que plusieurs stocks de saumon sont à la baisse.
Alexandra noted that the disappearance of the killer whales coincided with the arrival in the early 90s of a new industry, Atlantic salmon farming. Over the years, more than 27 salmon farms have been established along the coast of the Bouchard archipelago.
This is at the very heart of the Bouchard archipelago. It's like the hub of a wheel with all these channels coming. And sitting here is an enormous Norwegian fish farm. They don't actually tell us how many salmon are in the pens, but we're guessing between 600,000 and 1 million.
Although the impact of this industry was still poorly understood, Alexandra suspected that there could be a link between the disappearance of the killer whales from the archipelago and the arrival of this industry. But how could she prove it? Alexandra Morton continued her research. She wanted to know if the high concentration of captive salmon in the farms could cause viral diseases or a proliferation of parasites which would harm the wild salmon populations, the main source of food for killer whales.
My specialty was whales, and now I was looking at algae and fish and disease. I couldn't do it myself, so I would get on the internet and find somebody whose whole life was tumors in flatfish or sea lice. And I'd go to them and say, do you want to do this with me? And a surprising number of people said yes.
In the corner, there's some, oh, here it is.
Biologists, technicians and students came and worked on studies into the impact of sea farms on the environment.
Pink, 90.
The first research revealed a worrying situation. An abnormal quantity of sea lice seemed to be affecting the development of juvenile salmon. Scott Rogers is a biologist specialised in marine ecosystems and environmental science. She's involved in research on sea lice.
A sea louse is a parasite, a crustacean that's found on wild salmon. It's a natural parasite, and when the adults return to fresh water, they lose them. But when you introduce a permanent farm with 1 or 2 million Atlantic salmon, you create a breeding ground for sea lice.
So what happens now is that whatever got into the farm brews and grows and multiplies. And so in the spring, when the little guys come out of the rivers, they meet billions of sea lice. And they weren't designed for that.
Over the years, research teams have come and gone in Alexandra Morton's house, which in time became the Salmon Coastfield Station. The establishment of the research station and the support of collaborators has allowed Alexandra to return to her studies of cetaceans. In the last few years, Pacific white-sided dolphins have invaded the waters of Bouchard archipelago, and their numbers are constantly growing. Alexandra is wondering if this increased presence might not have contributed to the departure of the killer whales.
Their behaviors are completely different. The whales, you know, they generally just go on their way, but the dolphins like you. They like the boats and they come right up. They love to do like 6 things at once, all under the boat. They like people, but most animals don't like dolphins because they harass everything. They harass whales, they harass seals, they're very, well, I call them merry thugs.
For Alexandra, every observation is another piece to add to the big puzzle and allows her to have a better global view of the natural environments. Sometimes there are unexpected discoveries.
I don't know. I'd never seen that before. I saw that group of dolphins about 5 days ago, and there was no little babies. And so for me today, to see them in that area, I think they went there to have babies because the water's warmer. So those babies were so young, they're only a few days old. They still had the little fetal folds, and they didn't really know how to breathe right. They popped their heads up too much. That, for me, was very interesting. I want to go back there next July and see if the same thing happens.
For Alexandra Morton, the presence of newborns in this area is without doubt an indicator of the quality of the environment in the Bouchard archipelago, where organic production is very rich. And yet the salmon and killer whales are still missing. What exactly is happening with these 2 species?
I know we can bring them back. I know we could have millions of salmon return to British Columbia. The ocean is so productive right now. We got humpback whales back, we have sand lance, we have all these indicators, the dolphins are here. But I've been unsuccessful in convincing government that the wild salmon are important. And so, personally, it's very depressing. I feel like I'm losing.
I can understand the difficulty she has seeing that things are really changing. First, she was completely alone, one person, with this concern And now there are millions of people, not just here in Canada, but around the world, who share her concern. You have to say that is progress. Unfortunately, it's not victory.
Since her arrival in the Bouchard archipelago, Alexandra Morton has witnessed several disruptions that have changed the environment in her area. More determined than ever, she persists in her fight to raise people's awareness of the importance of preserving marine ecosystems. But can she really change things?
I'm going to turn these salmon back on. I'm going to bring the whales back, and this community is going to flourish. I can feel it in my soul, in my veins, and we're close. As I get older, I know more people, I have more influence, and every ounce of that's going to be used to bring this place back for the people and for the animals, because they are one thing.